begin, we have a prayer on top if you wish to pray with me. Please pray with me. God of our salvation, we falter before the demands of your word and turn away from your call to life. Pour out your mercy on us as you showed mercy to your people of old, that we may turn from our sinfulness and walk the path of self-emptying love made known in Jesus Christ. Amen. So we're going to do two things today, and then we'll to kind of finish talking about Matthew. The first, I want to continue talking about how he likes to really focus on the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and introduce this theme, which I'm going to propose to you, that he's casting a Jesus as a new Moses, or as kind of even better than Moses. So we'll look at a couple things there. And then there has been interest in talking about issues like adultery and divorce in this gospel. So that's on the back page. So let's begin with this idea of fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. So I gave you 3 columns there on the first page. They're parallels from the 3 Gospels. So we get Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talking about Jesus entering Jerusalem. This is Palm Sunday, right? And this is a kind of a common thing that scholars do. You can actually buy books that do this. They're called gospel synopses, where they put everything, like they have all 4 Gospels, but they try to have everything paired up. I think I did this a couple days ago, where I actually gave you a photocopy out of one of these books. You can also get gospel harmonies. I recommend you don't buy those. So there's a difference between a harmony and a synopsis. What a harmony tries to do is take all 4 Gospels and put them in order, like there's a chronological order, right? That's really hard to do, because actually the Gospels are intentionally rearranging the stories sometimes. But 2, you can see what's going on here is this: there isn't a chronology here. This is just 3 different people telling the same event. They've either all been eyewitnesses to it, or they've heard reports, and they're all telling the same basic story, right? I also think it's fairly clear that if this was written down, which we, obviously it was, somebody copied somebody again, because they're so close, right? Again, we're reading it in translation, but even then, it's pretty apparent, right, how clear they are, right? So if you look at Matthew and Luke, even in verse 1, they're almost identical, right? When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, right? There's a few differences, but they're very similar. So I'm going to propose something we do a little bit different today, which is give you 5-6 minutes to read all 3 of these accounts and to point on anything that's different. Also being aware of what's similar, right? And then to think about why might they tell the story different, right? So you could think of it in terms of, if all of us here were trying to tell the same story, why might we tweak it? Why might we add a little detail here or take a detail out? I presume because we want to emphasize a particular thing or draw attention to something. So just look at what they do differently. So I'll let you do that now. Hal, we're reading these 3 columns and seeing what's different. Hello, Kathy. I'll give you one more a minute. Okay, who wants to be brave and tell us what they saw? Jane.
At least the Matthew talks about a donkey and a colt.
Right, so Matthew's got 2 animals. That's the big thing I want to draw our attention to. But is there anything else, Doug? You had. Right, so that's the other thing Matthew does. So Matthew quotes an Old Testament passage, right? It says in verse 4, "This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through a prophet," right? And what he quotes is kind of his paraphrase of Zechariah 9:9, which I put there below, right? Anything else?
Matthew and Mark use Hosanna, and Luke does not.
Yeah.
Now, what is
Listen, I think
the
it'd be
meaning of
similar.
Hosanna? I learned one time.
Basically means let us praise, let us worship, right? So, I mean, but it's a Hebrew word. So, like, here's one thing that we tend to notice is that Luke drops these foreign language phrases. So they're all writing in Greek, right? But Luke and Matthew keep Hebrew words, whereas Luke frequently either translates them or just drops them because he assumes his audience doesn't know them. That's what we think. So we're assuming his audience is Gentiles who aren't familiar with these Jewish Hebrew terms. So he doesn't use them. So we start to, these are very educated guests that we're trying to think who's the audience they're writing to, right? So that's one little thing about Luke, right?
Are these not personal accounts of what happened?
Well, but this is, so yeah, that's what's happening. I mean, this is, each of these 3 gospel writers is telling the same event, right? They're pretty much word for word the same, often, right? But there's a couple small changes, right? Matthew adds this Old Testament quote, notice they're all kind of the same length, which means he's shortened everything else. If you look at Mark and Luke, they tell the story of, go get this donkey. If anybody asks you what you're doing, tell them the Lord who needs it. They all three tell that part, but in Matthew's account, he doesn't tell us the part where someone actually did ask them, and they give the answer, whereas Matthew and Luke do. He's trying to shorten his account because he's added things.
It was interesting. One said it was a bystander, and another said it was the owner.
Yeah.
I found that it was interesting in Mark and Matthew that they reference David, and Luke does not.
Right.
And I wonder, again, that's Matthew's effort to connect to the Old
Yep.
Testament. But I also wonder if they were emphasizing, this fact or belief by some that he really was going to be a descendant
Right.
of the king. And so that gave him lineage, and then the disciples and Luke are praising God.
Right.
And they're not praising God in the other two.
Yep.
I wonder too, is there some significance that in two of them they say the colt had never been ridden?
Right. The other two emphasize this, right? And so, like, they're emphasizing to different things, right? So, and again, here's where, as scholars, we try to figure out what's going on, right? So, if we think Mark is the original, that's what most people think, Mark's first, and then we look at Matthew and Luke, and try to figure out why did they keep things, why did they cut things out, why did they add things, we begin to sort of think, like, what are they trying to emphasize, right? Because you can see that, right? If Mark has this, right, the colt hasn't been ridden, untied, and bring it. Luke just copies that. Matthew deletes it.
For Hosanna, I had always heard that my cloak is getting dirty.
That's not quite what it means, but I get the right. But then by this, so we're just trying to pay attention to some of these differences, right? And again, there's nothing earth-shattering in here that they change. It doesn't severely affect the story, right?
The one only mentions Mount Olive.
Right. Only one of the names. Well, actually, no. All of them say the Mount Olives in the first verse.
Oh.
Yep.
Memory's pretty short.
That's okay. Right.
Are we reading too much into this?
Well, but it's just actually worth asking, like, why are they doing this, right? Especially if, again, it's one thing if all they had was oral accounts, right? So if all of them just have this oral account, even if Mark is first, we can say our memories are faulty, right? But if, again, it's so similar that it's really hard to think that all they have is an oral account.
I think I really feel like the distinction, I brought this up in the last verses, where Matthew and Mark refer to David.
Yeah.
Their audience is not necessarily the same as Luke.
Right.
Luke's audience doesn't mention it all because they don't care about it.
Then, yeah, if
I really think
Luke is preaching to a Gentile audience, right, they might not even know who David is.
And I think that's a clue to even today's times.
Yep.
We have different Bibles and
Yep.
different, books and that sort of things about our faith and God.
Yep.
And I think that's because of the audiences.
Right, absolutely.
The other thing I just wanted to say
Yep.
that maybe you talked about this when I was sitting
Yep.
down, but what struck me was the last line in Luke where it says peace in heaven and glory in highest heaven.
Yep.
So I'm thinking, what's the difference between heaven and highest heaven? So maybe you talked about that.
Well, if you see all of them say highest heaven, well, then Luke says the highest heaven. I think some of that's just kind of being poetic, right? But it is kind of this expression, like glory to God in heaven, glory to God in the highest heaven, right? It's
How many other levels are there?
I've never been, so I don't know. Right. But anyway, it's just worth pointing out and saying, and you can actually do this with all kinds of passages. Like you can go through and they'll tell the same parables, right? And there'll be little differences, and just it's worth asking why, right? Especially again if Matthew and Luke really do have a copy of Hallmark on their desk. Why are they tweaking things, right? Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
So the argument against that theory that Mark was first that I always hear is that if Mark is the writer that's in a hurry,
Yep.
trying to get to where it counts,
Yep.
he's trying to get to Easter as soon as
Yep.
possible. Is it possible or probable that Mark took Matthew and just cut out all of the stuff that he thought was in the way of getting to his goal of getting to Easter?
So my argument against that, again, not just me, this is the common argument, is actually compare the first, let's say 3-4 verses of Matthew and Mark. Mark is way more wordy. Right, it's actually Matthew who's got more terse prose, right? I mean, just compare. I'll read Mark. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden, untied, and bring it," right? Then I'll just read verse 2 from Matthew. Saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately he's already cutting things out. He's making it shorter.
Well, wait a minute. If you look at the word immediately,
Yeah.
it's in exactly the same position on the page. So that far, although there are some differences
Yep.
in the text, the length is about the same.
But he cuts things like as you enter it. So he actually, and that's if you go through the whole thing, he does that constantly. He's constantly making Mark more concise. He doesn't have, because you actually don't need the phrase as you enter it.
Right.
It helps a little bit, but you don't need it. So this is constantly happening. They're actually making Mark better, right?
This is just like the police officer that interviews for witnesses
Right.
in the accident.
Well, and again, this is kind of perhaps what's happening is we're just getting 4 different people telling a story. But Mark is the shortest, right, gospel by far. Matthew and Luke have all kinds of other things in them, right? But they're constantly what they copy from Mark, they're making more concise, which tells us they're actually adding a whole lot of stuff. If you turn the handout over real fast, the bottom, where it says Roman numeral 3, that's all the stuff that's only in Matthew. It's not in any of the other Gospels. Right? So think about that long genealogy, all of his Christmas stories about the Magi, right? That's only in Matthew, right? The idea that the virgin birth fulfills a prophecy in Isaiah, only Matthew tells us that. Sermon on the Mount, pretty big deal, Sermon on the Mount. It's only in Matthew. Luke gives us a very reduced version, right? Look at all the parables that are only in Matthew. So they're adding all kinds of things, right? They're telling us they've got the things they want to emphasize. And what I'm proposing is this comparison I'm doing here gives us a window in to at least some of their concerns. So the big thing that's going on here, obviously, is that Matthew has Jesus get 2 animals. Verse 4, or actually it's verse 5, right? He quotes the Old Testament, right? So he gets a donkey and a colt, the foal of a donkey. And they brought both of them to Jesus in verse 7. They put their cloaks on them. I presume that means both animals. And he sat on them. And we don't know if that them is both animals or he sits on all of the cloaks or what it is, right? So, think of every picture you've ever seen on Palm Sunday. Jesus is riding on a donkey.
Oh, no, I've seen some with Jesus on the donkey in his feet.
So occasionally you see that, and then what are they trying to do? They're trying to give us this a story, trying to be faithful. Whenever I read this, I think of Jesus like he's in a circus. He's like standing on both of them. That's the image I have, right? That's silly to think of it this way. So why is it happening? Well, it's happening because Matthew's going back and reading his Old Testament, and he's trying to convince his audience that Jesus is the Messiah, that the Old Testament's pointing to him. So he's going to get it exact. So if we read one, if we look on the bottom of that page, Zechariah 9:9, right, says, he will enter triumphant and victorious as he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Right. So this is the passage he quotes. Right. We look at some other passages like Genesis 49, verse 11. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to a choice vine, he washes his garments in wine and his robe in the blood of grapes. Right. So a prophecy perhaps about Jesus dying. Two animals. Right. Go ahead. Oh, so very good. So this is the problem. And neither of these passages is talking about two animals, these Old Testament passages. It's poetry. Both of them are poetry. This is good Hebrew poetry. If you read the Psalms, you'll notice this all the time. There's this feature in Hebrew poetry called parallelism, where you say the same thing twice, but not quite identically.
Yeah, like heaven and highs.
Yeah, like heaven and highs, that's the same thing. It's poetry, right? You're saying the same thing, but you say it a little bit different. So you say a donkey, the foal of a donkey, right? It's a poetic feature, right? So actually, Mark and Luke have it right. The prophecy in these passages is one animal, not two. Matthew is overly literal. And we should ask why. Right. But we should especially ask why if we think his gospel is written to the Jews. He should know better. So should they. Right. Well, Luke's the one writing to the Gentiles. We can perhaps forgive him if he made this a mistake. Matthew shouldn't make it. So either he made a mistake and he isn't who we think he is, his audience isn't who we think they are, this whole theory we have that he's writing to a Jewish audience goes out the window, or we can say maybe something else is happening, right? So he should know it's poetry, right? But he really wants his audience to think of Jesus as the Messiah. He wants to convince them that the whole Old Testament is about Jesus, and he also is kind of quietly casting Jesus in this picture of Moses. To prove that I'm not making this up, got this little book, right? It's a whole book about Matthew. It's called the New Moses. It's all kinds of scholars who write books like this, right? And he goes through the whole gospel and shows out how, like, all the time, there's these comparisons being made between Jesus and Moses. Jesus is even better. We'll get into this a bit more, right? So if this is what Matthew's doing, and then we're going to get real deep into the weeds here, right? But perhaps he's doing something here. So he knows this other verse. So if you look on my handout again, Exodus 4:20. So again, there's two different versions of the Old Testament. There's the Hebrew Bible. The Bible that you have, the Bible that's in our pews upstairs, the Bible that you have in your homes probably, are translated from the Hebrew Old Testament. Right? But I've been talking for the last couple of weeks, talked about the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament actually made before Jesus. The people of Jesus' time are reading both. And occasionally there's differences, because again, that always happens with translation, right? So the Hebrew version talks, if you look at Exodus 4:20, it says, and Moses took his wife and children and put them on a donkey, one animal, and he went back to Egypt. but in the Septuagint version, it says he puts them on draft animals. Well, Matthew's got this in his head. He probably thinks his audience is reading the Greek version. So he goes to great lengths to make his account correspond to the Old Testament, especially since this is associated with, well, Moses. If we go back to the infancy story, right? What happens, Jesus is born. This is in Matthew's account. Jesus is born, then what happens?
Children that are with them.
Right, we get the wise men, right? They come. They don't go back to Herod. Herod comes and kills all the other baby boys, right? Why does Jesus escape?
They go to Egypt.
They go to Egypt, right? Who else went to Egypt? Moses, right? And actually in Matthew chapter 2, he has the line, "Out of Egypt I've called my son," which is actually quoting the Old Testament, talking about Moses and Israel, that God calls them out of Egypt. So he's setting up this typology. Jesus is just like Moses. Jesus is just like the whole nation of Israel. The things that happened to them in the Old Testament happened to Jesus too. So he's already told us Jesus is like Moses because he went to Egypt to be saved. Well, Moses had to go to Egypt so he didn't get killed. When things are okay, he gets to go back and challenge Pharaoh. Same thing happens for Jesus. When Herod dies, he's safe and can come back. He's already given us this idea, right? Our problem is we've heard these gospel stories hundreds of times, and we've heard all four. Well, Matthew's audience probably only had Matthew's gospel. They didn't have the other three. His community only had his. And if they're hearing it for the first time, they're going to go back to the story of, well, Jesus was in Egypt, just like Moses was in Egypt. And now we're here. We still have that idea in our head. And just like Moses had these two animals, Jesus had these two animals. He's giving us every little hint we possibly can to make this connection, right? Even if he has to go to a different version of the Old Testament to draw our attention to it, right?
Well, if we weren't around to hear the pause.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, there's all kinds of things here of like this was meant to be heard, not read, right? So he's doing. I mean, he's just trying to make all of these connections.
There's another thing too.
Yep.
Jesus did this back to them
Yep.
as well. Said, okay, it's not time yet.
Yep.
And I will fulfill the scriptures.
Yep.
So,
But I mean, it's just worth pointing out. This is what Matthew's doing, which is why he's constantly quoting the Old Testament. He quotes the Old Testament more than any of the other gospel writers, and he tells us Jesus did this thing in order to fulfill this Old Testament passage. Well, Mark doesn't do this at all. He actually kind of thinks we know it. Doesn't think we need to point it out. Matthew thinks we need to point it out. And Luke is like, you guys are Gentiles, you don't know your Old Testaments anyway, so I'm not even going to bother. I'll explain all the terms, right? Begins to tell us things about who the intended audience is. Yep.
So this person, Moses goes back, but also reading that in Matthew, I just find it absolutely ironic that Joseph and Mary go to Egypt to escape. And so, is there some underlying reason why they're telling us in addition to the Moses thing, or is it because they fled Egypt so they could worship God because they were restrained? And so you would think that Egypt would be a mortal enemy of Jews, and yet somehow the Egyptians are willing to accept Jewish people going back to Egypt. And how is it they would be safe, and how is it that they would be...
Well, in this case, it would be, I mean, it isn't like there's waves and waves of Jews coming into Egypt. It's Joseph and Mary and Jesus for perhaps all of 2 years at the most, right? So it's one family going over. Matthew doesn't explain this very much, but presumably what we do know at the time is Egypt isn't under the political control of Herod. So he's completely safe. Herod can't reach there. So we're told they go to Egypt to be safe, right? But notice, none of the other Gospels tell us this story.
Don't the original Jews, Joseph's family goes there to be safe too because of the famine. And that's the only place they could be fed.
Right,
They leave their homeland as well to be safe, and I just find it interesting, this parallel that Jesus leaves his homeland to go to Egypt.
Well, so this is what Matthew wants us to do. He wants us to make all these connections. He wants us to say, look at Jesus. He's just like Israel, right? Because that's actually part of what he wants us to do. Is he wants us to think of Jesus as like in the terms of Moses. He's the person that God has called. He's the person that God has blessed. We're going to get into some other things, right? Jesus is also all of Israel. He's the personification of Israel in one person. So God's made a covenant with Israel. That covenant's going to get fulfilled through what Jesus does. Because Jesus does what Israel was supposed to do. He's faithful. He keeps the covenant. Thereby he saves everybody. I mean, he's making all of these connections. The thing that might bother us is this just literary? We don't know. I mean, is it just literary, or did it really, is it a historical fact, right? I think we all want it to be historically factual, but that's also because we're people who live in 2024 and have been shaped by Western history, right? This is a little bit different. He's trying to tell us who Jesus is, and making these kinds of literary connections for him is perfectly okay, right? So I don't think it really matters which one it is. He's trying to explain to us who he thinks Jesus is, right? And these are the kind of things that he's doing, right? And so he wants us to think of Jesus in these terms. Yep.
Well, this discussion of Jesus being like Moses has reminded me that decades ago I was reading type, anti-type sorts of literatures about, and one of these books said, if you take the Old Testament story of going into Egypt, coming out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea, going through into the desert, and then across Jordan and into the Holy Land. This is the book was actually called Journey into Fullness. And that this was an analogy or a type of the gospel. And so the New Testament is the anti-type, right? It's the fulfillment of this type. So I don't know, was Matthew just beginning to unpack the possibility that what happened to Israel is actually a foretelling of Jesus, and Jesus is actually doing what Moses and the Israelites did. I'm not saying it very well, but is actually doing the real thing.
Yes,
and
that's what Matthew's trying to get us to see. Like, so, and that's what's going to happen. Is so. I mean, again, you can think of this. You're a Jew living sometime in the first century. You know your Old Testament really, really well. This is your whole faith, right? You hear this with Jesus story, and you're like, there's some things in common here with the Old Testament, right? He sounds a lot like Moses and Israel. The same things happened to him, right? So you start to make that comparison, and you think of, so there's Moses up on top, there's all of Israel, Jesus is underneath, he's like one of us. What Matthew wants us to do by the time we get to the end is to flip it. Jesus is the real thing. Moses and Israel are like earlier versions that point to it. But Jesus is the archetype. The whole Old Testament is a prophecy about a Jesus read in this typological way. But he's the type. right? Everything else is going to point to him. That's what he wants us to see.
Involved so much, but was there an angel involved in Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus heading to Egypt? Were they not somehow informed?
The angel was a traveling.
Well, yeah, I mean, an angel appears to Joseph and tells him to take the whole family to Egypt.
Yeah.
And I think it's the angel Gabriel. I don't know if it tells us the name, but like, it definitely tells us the name when the angel comes to Mary and tells her she's pregnant with Jesus. The angel appears again to Joseph and says, get them to safety.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, so it's just some other examples of how all of this happens. So you already kind of alluded to one, Dale, but what does Jesus do after, like, he begins his ministry, he gets baptized by John the Baptist, then what happens? He goes to the desert. He's tempted by Satan. How long is he there? 40 days.
40 years.
There's your comparison. I mean, Jesus can't go out there for 40 years. It would take the story would take way too long, right? But the 40 days is this comparison. He goes out into the wilderness. He fasts. He's tempted, right? It's just like Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. And then what does he do? He comes back and he enters the promised land. He begins his ministry, right? Go ahead.
But Israel was delayed the 40 years going in because they didn't believe the promise. Right. They didn't rest in the promise. And so God said, I'm upset with you. You're all going to die in the desert except Joshua and Caleb. Yeah. And then we'll go in. But then I keep hearing these echoes in Hebrews too, where it says there is a rest that is still available to those who believe in Jesus. And there's a very strong resonance between the story of the people not going into the land because they didn't have faith, and we can go into the land, enter into the land. And there was something earlier today where you were saying something, I thought, man, that sure sounds like...
Right, there's echoes. There's echoes. And again, Hebrews, what is Hebrews? Hebrews is clearly a book written by a Jew to a community of Jews who are trying to figure out how they follow Jesus. So he's making all those Old Testament connections. So, I mean, at a very basic level, I'm trying to point out is these gospel authors, yes, they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, but they have intended audiences in mind. It's not you and me, right? It's just not we're not the intended audience. We're coming after, right? But to understand what's going on here well, we need to try to figure out who their intended audience is, and we're seeing why they're doing what they're doing. And one of the things he's really trying to communicate to us is all of this Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. Israel is a kind of a pre-form of Jesus. Moses is a pre-form of Jesus. Here's some other things. Jesus preaches a sermon on the Mount, right? And he comes down from the mountain to preach it. So you go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, that's what it tells us. He comes down. I don't have it on the handout, right? Who else went up a mountain and got something from God and came back down and taught? It's the Ten Commandments, right? Moses goes up on the mountain. He comes down, right? Teaches the people, right? So again, there's this comparison. Jesus coming down from the mount is like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, oftentimes what Jesus is doing is, you have heard it said, he quotes the Old Testament, but I say, and he gives us this authoritative teaching, right, which isn't a contradiction of the Old Testament, but also often he's making it stricter, which we're going to come to in just a minute, right? And what is he doing? He's saying, I have the authority to interpret this and even tweak it. I'm better than Moses. It's part of what he's trying to tell us, right? Another thing, I don't have this on the handout. In chapters 8 and 9, it's just this long story of Jesus going around and performing miracles and healing people. How many miracles do you think he performs?
More than was written in the book.
I know, but like how many actual distinct stories do we get?
Are you talking about what he cures?
Not like we actually get 10, like he cures lepers and children and.
He was supposed to get 40.
Well, he's supposed to get 10. Because what does Moses do to get the people out of Egypt? 10. Well, 10. It was not 10, but it's also the 10 plagues. I mean, this is all intentional. He wants us to make these connections, right? Here's the big one. If you turn your
we didn't written down all that.
right. I mean, that's in John, but like Matthew gives us 10 stories in a row to get us to think about Moses. This is in your journals. There's an outline here of the book of Matthew. If you look on the back of your handout, I actually hand wrote it in this morning, but it says the 5 books of Matthew. So in those verses that I've given you there, right? I gotta find where it's. What it says there every time there's this a phrase that Matthew uses to sort of, and it's like the end of a book, like we're moving on to a new story, right? And actually, each of these books works the same. We get Jesus doing things, and then we get a real long time where he's talking. So in the first book, we get the kind of a prologue. Then we get Jesus getting baptized and going on in the wilderness. Then we get the Sermon on the Mount, right? End of that book. In chapters 8 and 10, this will be book 2, we get a bunch of miracle stories. And then the bulk of chapter 10 is what we call the missionary discourse. But again, it's a long sermon by Jesus. This happens 5 times. It actually appears like the book of Matthew has 5 chapters. Who else wrote a book that's got 5 parts? Well, that's the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Bible are all ascribed to Moses. We get the same kind of thing. Like he's constantly trying to get us to think. Let's think about Jesus like he's Moses, right? So this is just one thing I think it's helpful to sort of see. This is what he's doing. Very quickly, let's look at divorce. I didn't realize what time it was. So my connection to this was in part of, if we're going to continue this theme of Moses, right? This is the one place where Moses is actually explicitly mentioned, right? So it's the whole idea of right? It's in chapter 19, verse 7. The Pharisees said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of a dismissal and divorce her," right? And Jesus says, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. From the beginning it wasn't so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife," and it goes on, right? So here, Jesus is actually contradicting Moses, and he makes things more strict, right? So Moses has room for divorce. The Old Testament law is don't commit adultery, right? Jesus says don't look after a woman and lust after her. The Old Testament forbids action. Don't do this. The New Testament with Jesus, he actually bans the feeling, right? It's way stricter. He does the same thing, by the way, with a murder. The Old Testament says don't kill. Jesus says don't get angry. Right? So this is this pattern. He's actually making it harder, right?
But you
Go ahead.
He did not get angry. He would not have very much murder with him.
Well, right. So
He's going to the root.
he's going to the root. He's going to the root. But it's also impossible if we read it, if we just leave it there, right? If a person does something awful to us, we can't help but get angry. I don't care how holy and perfect you are, you're going to get angry, right? Same thing with something like lust, right? Whether you're male or female or whatever, right? You see an attractive person, you're not in control of the attraction that you have. you're in control of what you do with it, right? But you're not actually in control of this happening to you. So what is Jesus up to? I think this is worth unpacking a bit. Hal?
So if Jesus says we're not to get angry,
Yep.
Was he not angry?
Well, absolutely. Right. So I think this is where we need to, I want to unpack some of this, right? So it seems like he doesn't just forbid adultery, he forbids the very feeling of lusting after someone, right? So it's worth pointing out a verse, I'm going to find the verse where it says, so this is concerning a divorce. I say to you, anyone who right, well, no, actually, no, it's up in the adultery part. Anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery. It can also be translated, anybody who looks at a woman with the intention of lusting after her. So it isn't merely, I'm walking down a street, or I'm in the, line at Kamaya, this attractive person walks by me. It's, I'm intentionally looking, and I look twice. Right? My goal is to actually look at this person, or to think about this person in a way to lust after them, right? So it isn't just that it happens to you, it's that you're going to do it on purpose. You're going to think about it. That's what Jesus wants to eliminate. Also with...
The lust is the action?
So, but it's something that happens to you, and rather than turning away, you do it on purpose. You indulge it, right? Anger is the same, right? Someone can hurt me. I can be angry at it. And I can say, I'm going to try to forgive this person and move on. Or I can say, I'm going to sit here and think about how I can get revenge. I'm going to plan it out, even if I don't do it. Right? That's what we're actually being asked to resist, right?
James said something like that in the first chapter, right?
Yep.
If you're tempted, don't dwell. That's right.
And I also think it's helpful to ask why he's forbidding a divorce. So really, really quick. Again, in Jesus' day, obviously women don't have the same rights as men. In Greek culture, Greco-Roman culture, adultery is understood as don't have a sex with a woman in a way that you'll dishonor her. So actually it's really only about upper class people. It's perfectly okay for an upper class male to have a slave that he also has sex with, or to go see prostitutes. What he can't do is go to his neighbor who's also upper class and cheat on him with his spouse, because it causes a social chaos. It's actually about disorder in society. Amongst the Jews, if we actually go to the Old Testament and look at the commands, it's don't do this so that you don't hurt your fellow Israelite. It's actually about property. The woman is treated as property, and it's you don't use your fellow Israelites' property. What's concerned isn't the woman. It's keeping a social order rooted in deeply patriarchal systems. This is what Jesus is overturning. He's actually saying, no, this whole way of thinking about this is a problem, right? So his concern is, what's going to happen if you commit adultery and have a divorce? By the way, there's a pattern almost always with Jesus. He talks about adultery, divorce, and children in that order, right? So what happens if you get a divorce if you're a woman in this era, especially if you're under kind of Jewish? You're screwed. I hate to put it, but that's just the truth. You have no legal protection. You probably lose access to your children, or they come with you, and you're all going to be in poverty. And what Jesus is trying to do is to say you can't get a divorce unless your spouse has been unfaithful to you. That's the one exception he seems to introduce. What's happening is people are getting a divorce just because they want to. Jesus is saying, no. Go ahead, Sal.
I read somewhere that during the time that Jesus was alive, that contracts were actually written with marriages, and so that if there was a divorce, the woman, sometimes whatever the bride money was,
Right.
was returned.
Sometimes they get it back.
It wasn't like they were kicked out with nothing, at least there was some protection.
But if you were wealthy, yes.
Okay.
If you're poor, no.
If you were marrying Joseph, no.
No, if you're marrying Joseph, you're in big trouble. I mean, if that's, right, Joseph is trying, when he says he's going to divorce Mary, right, he's trying to do it in a way where she's going to be protected. Because he knows if he doesn't do it that way, she could probably get stoned, right? But if she's going to be destitute. So Jesus is actually saying, no, divorce should be really hard. Why? Because we need to take care of the women and the children. He's actually trying to sort of say we need ways to protect them. A system doesn't protect them, right? So it isn't, and I think what's helpful here is when we think about how we're going to do this now, we need to follow the Spirit more than the letter of the law, right? Because our context is way different, right? In this era, probably for one, your husband's probably going to be 10 years older than you, at least, on average, right? We're not going to live into our 80s and 90s. We don't have birth control. All the kinds of other things that we have that don't exist in this era, right? We have wives who are the major breadwinners who would hurt their husbands if they got a divorce. In our era. This was not obviously in Jesus' era, right? But that's, again, one thing that's happening here is the value, the thing that Jesus is really concerned about is the physical and mental health and well-being of everybody involved. So he's teaching to a particular context in which who gets hurt here? Women and children. That's why a divorce shouldn't happen. We should take care of them, right? We've got a whole different setup where we may actually need to think maybe a divorce here is the best thing to get people out of an abusive relationship, right? That's actually what Jesus is caring about is, are these people taken care of? Our society is way different than his, right? We need to figure out how to get the value of what he's teaching fit into our world, not just slavishly follow it. Bob, and then we should probably end.
Just saying, the shortcut is, they work hard and so they could divorce women for any reason. I heard once they could just say, I divorced you three times. And you're done. And so the law of Moses was to protect women.
Yep.
And Jesus is saying we really shouldn't have to have this structure set up in society because men should stop being hard-hearted. And so it's like we should go back to like the Garden of Eden, when things were perfect and men, if they would just stop being hard-hearted, we wouldn't need the law of Moses.
What Jesus is trying to do is to say, what's the point of a marriage? It keeps women and children safe. It protects them, and it also gives us order and stability, right?
But it didn't the young women plantations.
Right, absolutely, right? So when we go forward into time and have different contexts, we need to figure out how to adapt, right? And that's the key. We could talk about this for a long time. Okay. The next week is Mark.